Thank you very much, Bo. It's a pleasure to be here, and particularly a pleasure to be invited by a former student. I have to say, I had a decent number of students, but it's remarkable how well they've done in their life, not only in academic, but also in the public sector. A failed PhD is something that I wanted to go on the academic market, but decided to go to industry. Now is assistant to the prime minister in Germany. So I think I've done well, at least on that dimension. Okay, so let me start actually. So this is, by the way, much based on joint work with Oliver Hart. So in honor of Bo and also Per, I want to start with this picture that most people probably do not recognize what it is, but this is a picture of Milton Friedman and Joe Stigler walking back from the Quadrangle Club, probably early 1970s. Okay? Now, why do I start with this picture? Because what I'm going to say in a second is very much dependent on these two characters and the fact that in spite of the fact they were having lunch together every day, particularly in the early 70s, they didn't reconcile part of the literature. So what I'm talking about, so let's go back to the 1970s. This talk will be very much started in 1970s because a lot of things happened there. So let's start in 1970. This is September 13, 1970. And this is the time where Milton Friedman writes for the New York Times the famous piece about the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Now, I'm going to summarize his argument in a second, but I want you to first realize one thing. The pictures are important. So these pictures are the picture of GM. And at GM at the time, there is the first basically campaign of activist shareholders will bring the first black board members at GM. Okay? And those are Naderites. Nader himself is not involved, and I will explain in a second why. But those are Naderites. And so the New York Times invites Milton Friedman. Now, Milton Friedman has basically already written this piece inside Capitalism and Freedom 1962. But nobody has read it. Capitalism and Freedom was not a success when it came out. And the New York Times on purpose asked Milton Friedman to make the point. And what point does it make? Is that the free enterprise, in a free enterprise system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of business. Now, legally, this is wrong. Well, let's forget that. And he has direct responsibility to his employers. And they say the responsibility is to conduct the business in according with their desires. And so far, so good, except for the legal mistake. And now you say, which generally, so Milton Friedman is very careful when he writes, so generally is to make as much money as possible. And then he's quick to say, while confirming to the basic rule of society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical customs. Okay, so that seems, yes, on the one hand, it's very strong that they only have to maximize profits, but there is this caveat. Now, this is written in September of 1970, and in the spring of 1971, Joe Stigler publishes this piece, which is one of the pieces that gave him the Nobel Prize, on the theory of economic regulation. And because there is a delay in publication, I can expect that probably was thinking about this piece at the same time as that Milton Friedman is writing his piece on maximizing profits. And he says very clearly, as a rule, regulation is acquired by industry and is designed and operated primarily for its benefits. Okay, those are pretty strong words. So now let's try to put them together. Okay, these two guys are walking back every day. What are they talking about? They say, okay, if you are Friedman, you say you maximize profits given rules. If you're Stigler, you say, wait a minute, a powerful incumbent changed the rules to maximize profits. And so if you put them together, if powerful, you maximize profits without any rule, right? Because you design your own rules. So there is no restraint. And so the idea that powerful firms, when they are unrestrained profit maximizing, can be tamed by regulation is certainly inconsistent with the view of Stigler, but also inconsistent with evidence. Okay? So this fact, and there are a lot of people, including my friend Lucien Bettger, who say, oh, you still maximize profits, but as long as there is X and Y and Z, but the point is, cannot be as long as, because powerful firms are changing the rule of the games. And so one thing that is pretty clear, and here you see the contradiction in full force, is if really you have to maximize profits at the whole time, as a CEO, you have a duty to lobby. So if you consider the privately managed prisons, they benefit from higher incarceration rates and longer sentences. That's increasing demand, okay? If you're a profit-maximizing firm, you want to increase your demand. How do you increase your demand? You manipulate those things. So do they have a duty to lobby to increase the length of the sentences? Okay? And if you think that this is absurd, it's not absurd, because if you read in the annual report of private prisons, they say we don't lobby for this because they are afraid that people think that. And when I say that in my class, one guy's raised a hand and said, wait a minute. They're saying that one of their risks is the reduction in sentences. They are not lobbying on this ground. They are failing their shareholders. Okay? What about oil companies? They benefit from fossil fuel consumption. There is no doubt about that. So should they lobby to slow down the transition to renewable? Do they have a duty, a fiduciary duty, to finance climate deniers? Is that their responsibility? Because after all, that's what they are doing. So let me actually look at this is a phenomenal piece done by Greenpeace, that they pretended to interview a lobbyist for Exxon, and they tape him. And so this is the lobbyist for Exxon.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yeah. Yes. Did we hide our science? Absolutely not. Yeah. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that. Yeah. We were looking out for our investments. We were looking out for our shareholders. And
so you see, that's not an hypothetical. That's exactly what Exxon does. And so there's this famous cartoon from the New Yorker that we destroyed the planet, but for a short period of time, we created a lot of shareholder value. Now, the question is, for whom all this is done? And as the guy said in an interview, first of all of this is legal, which makes it even more scary, because if you say this is illegal, then Friedman is right, you have to follow the rules of the game, and the rule is not to do anything illegal, blah, blah, blah. But if it's legal, then there is no restraint whatsoever, okay? And for whom this is done. So if you look at who owns the equity in the United States, there is a big chunk of foreign investors, but there is a big chunk, which is the blue, that is the pension fund of US workers. So at the end of the day, all of this is done for us, okay? So there is this, again, from the 70s, beautiful picture of Pogo that sees the pollution and say, we have seen the enemy is us. So we are at the same time the victims and the perpetrators. The victims because we're victim of this, but the perpetrator because this is done in our name. And again, speaking of the 70s, maybe this is 68, but we're pretty close. You remember sort of when you create something that is set on a mission, and this something is taking over. We created this phenomenal institution, the public corporation, but we put a mission, and this mission is gonna kill us. And if you remember of this...
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
So this is exactly what it feels with a lot of corporations. The corporations say, I'm doing for you, and the mission is too important for you, single person, to jeopardize it. And as a result, we jeopardize everything. So now I put the thing in pretty stark terms. How can we resolve this tension? Because this tension is really destroying capitalism itself, something that we don't want to do it. And so I think that we need to think about two aspects which are important. The first one that the 70s in particular, but all the economic literature has tried to push under the rug, is the fact that firms have a lot of political power. And this should be considered directly in the theory of the firm. So when Friedman talks, he talks very much about businesses that should not do anything else other than maximize profits, because otherwise they become basically unadulterated socialism, okay? However, I challenge you to recognize who writes the following sentences that are written about the same time as Friedman's piece, okay? And say, the days long past when the chief executive officer of a major corporation discharges his responsibility by maintaining a satisfactory growth of profits with due regard to the corporation public and social responsibility. If our system is to survive, top management must be equally concerned with protecting and preserving the system itself. And then it adds, business must learn the lesson that political power is necessary, that such power must be assiduously cultivated, and when necessary, it must be used aggressively and with determination, without embarrassment and without the reluctance which has been so characteristic of American business. Now, you understand this is written in the 70s because nobody with a straight face, not even our friend Steve Kaplan, will be able to say that today, okay? Now, I offer a drink to who tells me who is this person who wrote this. I claim is the most important person in US history nobody knows about, is indeed Lewis Powell. Okay, now who is Lewis Powell? Lewis Powell eventually became a Supreme Court justice. And for most people, especially the liberal, is known as, he was a Democrat, a staunch defender of abortion right. He cast the decisive vote for Roe versus Wade. So these days is considered kind of a liberal. However, he was a corporate lawyer and somebody very, very much interested in corporate power. And before he was appointed to the Supreme Court, he was asked by the American Chamber of Commerce to do a strategic plan to renovate kind of the mission of the American Chamber of Commerce that if you're not American, the American Chamber of Commerce is basically the association of industrialists that you have in Sweden, you have in all the countries in Western Europe, okay? And so so what he says in this memo plan, so you write this memo that remains secret for a little while, then Nixon appoints him to the Supreme Court. So this is important because he's going to talk about what the role of the Supreme Court should do for business. And then he really is the guy that started the legal tradition that led to Citizens United. Okay? There is a decision in 1978, Barclay versus Valeo, and another one that is where he really states that money is speech. And Citizens United is basically the consequences of that decision by Justice Powell. But in his memo say that basically the free enterprise system is attacked. Now, to his credit, 1970 was a period that makes today's revolt look like nothing because the Bank of America was so attacked so frequently that the joke at the time for the younger people where GPS did not exist, when people were asking for directions, say, you just follow the smoke. Because there were so many arson attacks to branches of Bank of America that to get to a Bank of America branch, you just follow the smoke. So in that context, he say, American enterprise system should fight back. How do they fight it back? Number one, we should fight back to campuses. And we should basically address the imbalance of many faculties. There are too many faculties that are leftist. We need to rebalance this. And particularly, we should enjoy a special rapport with the increasingly influential Graduate School of Business. Okay? And then he said, we need to conquer the media. How do we do the media? We need to develop a faculty of scholars to publish, but not in an academic paper. We need them to publish in the newspapers. And we need to be sure that they are seen as independent. So we need to finance independent, which is a bit of a contradiction in term, but they would do that. And then, of course, he talks about political power, and I already said that. And then he said, a neglected opportunities is the courts. Under our constitutional system, especially with activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social and political change. Wasn't he prescient? So much prescient that he applied it himself. And this is a vast opportunity for the American Chamber of Commerce, blah, 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 and they do. And then they also say we need to organize the shareholders as a source of power, okay? Now, the good thing is that Lewis Powell is not Jewish, because otherwise everybody will accuse me of anti-Semitism and a cabal and a conspiracy. Was not. And so you cannot accuse me of this. But I've been accused when I presented this sounds like a conspiracy theory. You know, some conspiracy theories are right, because not only he did it, part of it he implemented himself, but 25 years later there was a retirement party at the American Chamber of Commerce, and one guy raised the glass and said, we toast to the president of the American Chamber of Commerce that implemented the Power Memorandum. And if you look at the reality, they succeeded beyond expectations. Okay? So I think that, let me tell you one other factoid that I love. In 1969, a group of basically hippies got a bunch of shares of Dow Chemical and decide to try to go in front of Dow Chemical to stop Dow Chemical selling napalm to people that don't assure that it would be used against human beings. Translated, the US government that is dumping out on Vietnam, okay? So they wanted to stop them selling it to the US government, which was the only buyer, so basically stop producing it. Now, what is interesting is that Dow responded that they did not want this issue to be discussed because it's not a business-related issue, okay? I don't know what is more business than this. Are you selling to somebody that commit crime or not? This is pretty business decision. And speaking about ethics, now what is interesting is not only that this was denied, but it's interesting that Dow's defense was not that we are maximizing profits. No, we're actually losing money on this. We're doing out of patriotism. Okay? Now think twice, because at the same time as Friedman said, you only maximize profit, you shouldn't be a political firm, blah, 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 blah. You have his sort of cousin say, no, you should be a political firm, you should do all the things to push business over the democracy, and by the way, you should be patriotic, so you should not maximize profit, you should actually do what we want you to do. So when people say, let's stop politicizing firms, let's keep politics out of business, is fake, because politics is in business, has always been. It's just, do you see it or you don't see it, okay? And so now with this is, this is maybe too much of a Chicago element to it, but to see how this tension has been around and keeps being around, this tension applies to businesses, applies also to institutions like universities. Should university take a political position, etc.? And this has come back with Columbia in the recent time. And Chicago has a report written in 1967 called Calvin's Report that say that you should be neutral. And it's sold now, everybody says neutral. But if you read carefully the Calvin Report, and sorry for the infomercial, on the 12th of September, an episode of my podcast, Capitalism, will drop with an interview to the former president of the University of Chicago, 93 years old, Anna Gray. Amazing, that tells you all the history. And we discuss this thing, and we discuss the Calvin Report and say, does it mean that universities should never take a role? And 93, she remembered, number one, no, even the Calvin Report as an exception. In exceptional circumstances, this corporate activity of the university may appear as incompatible with paramount social values as to require careful assessment of the consequences. Okay, so she claims that in some situation you deviate from neutrality when this is too hard. Now, she also remembered that of the committee, there was one dissenter on one paragraph of that committee, and that was George Stigler. He dissented on that point. Anyway, So that's the first point. Now that we understand the political firms, now how do we handle these political firms? And the second point is we need to fix what was wrong of Friedman. So let's go back and say, remember, Friedman assumed that shareholder desire generally will be to make as much money as possible. But in economics, we don't think that people maximize income. They maximize utility, right? Certainly, I did not maximize income over my lifetime, otherwise I would not be an academic, and most of the people here would be the same. So we maximize utility. Now, what enters in your utility? Now, probably, do you really want your firm to overturn a democratically elected system? Some people might not mind. I personally would not like, okay? Or that a firms kill your environment, especially if you live around the block, okay? Do you like a firm to dump toxic in the river when you live downstream of the river? Of course not. Now, some people, and more included so, are even slightly pro-social. So they might pay a little light attention besides what impact themselves. So the first two are direct impact. But what it happens to society at large? So even if you're not involved, do you really want your firm to provide guns to Russia? It's very profitable, but do you really want to? It doesn't impact you directly, but it's something that you find pretty disgusting, okay? Hypothetically, it's not that hypothetically because it did happen. If you're IBM, do you want your machine to be used by the Nazi to count the Jews that were deported in the ghettos? You probably don't know because IBM was good at hiding it, but they did it, okay? And they did maximize profit. Do you really want to do that? No. So what Oliver and I said some time ago is company should maximize shareholder welfare, not value, okay? Welfare includes the utility of their shareholder. This is like, I like to say, this is like a small step for theory, a leap forward for humankind. Because it's not a big innovation, but this big change a lot. So one of the big advantage of shareholder value maximization is that it's simple, okay? You don't need to be very sophisticated. You look at the profits, you maximize the profits. Now, the moment you introduce welfare maximization, this becomes more complex because we need to figure out how to aggregate the preferences of the shareholders. So how do you do it? Let me start easy and then I will complicate. So let's assume that shareholders are, number one, well-informed about cost and benefits. That's not too crazy because managers, if they don't have a conflict of interest, they can actually inform them on this. And willing to vote on controversial issue and no cost. That's really a big assumption. And then they can transmit their preference through voting. So imagine a selfish shareholder, but that he doesn't like that a firm lobby its government. Then, so imagine that distorting regulation, think about the case of Exxon, distorting regulation, a company can generate a profit delta, but with the cost of society. So do I want Exxon to finance fake science? It is profitable, there's no doubt it's profitable, but I don't like it. And so that's the cost of society H. Now, I internalize this cost with a parameter lambda. So I am going to oppose lobbying every time my share of the profits is smaller than what I internalize of this cost, okay? And you can easily see that this is a very conservative thing because we never oppose socially efficient lobbying. So if you're concerned about socially efficient lobbying, it will never happen. We probably, most of the time, under-oppose lobbying that is inefficient. But so that's the reason why I say it's a small step. But it should be a non-controversial step because, after all, this is my company. If I am 100% owner, I can choose to do that. So why, if I am a 99.9% owner and Steve Kaplan has one share, I cannot do that anymore? That seems like a crazy solution. Now, if you are pro-social, then you factor in what is the cost of this to you, which is your share that you own multiply the cost delta, and then you internalize with a parameter lambda that can be very, very small. Think about this, almost an epsilon. What is the cost to society. What is the cost to society? Is H, the arm that you produce, minus the profits or the cost of fixing the production. Now, why is 1 minus SI? Is because I already internalized the SI directly. But so think about the way you write there is simpler. So you internalize a part of the social cost. Again, shareholder will only vote for something that is socially efficient. So they will never want you to do something that is inefficient. Probably they will invest too little. Now, there is an interesting result that we discover, and this is really the beauty of theory when you start a model and then you find a thing that you are not set up to find. And the result we found in this paper is that if you are a small shareholder, you end up really voting the right thing from a societal point of view. And let me explain why. So imagine that there are n shareholders, all equal wealth. This is not necessary, but it makes the thing simple. And you divide your wealth among n stocks, okay? So imagine that you have to decide whether to vote for preventing flaring in an oil company. Flaring is awful because release methane gas, but it is not profitable for most oil firms to stop flaring. So you're paying a little cost. So imagine that delta is the cost that you have to pay to do that, and H is the harm that you avoid to society. And so you are comparing your cost, which is delta divided by n, and you compare that with how much you are pro-social, lambda, times the benefit to society. Now, notice the following thing, that if you are well diversified, then your n goes to basically infinity. It becomes smaller and smaller because you own less and less of each firm. And so as you own less and less of each firm, the first term disappears, but the second doesn't. And so as a result, if you are a shareholder and you are asked what to vote for, you are going to vote to intervene every time H is bigger than D, the delta. And H bigger than delta is the socially efficient thing. So what I have shown to you is a well-diversified shareholder that is only slightly pro-social. So if you are a selfish pig, you're out of the picture. But short of that, you are going to vote what the central planner would want you to vote. And why? Because my vote matters only when it's pivotal. And so if my vote can change Exxon's strategy, it will have, in those rare circumstances, it will have to change Exxon's strategy. This is enormously important, right? And I compare what good do I do to humankind by changing Exxon's strategy with my personal cost of this. My personal cost, I own 3 shares of Exxon, is not that big. But the impact is gigantic. And so I'm going to vote for the right thing to do, okay? So if the majority of investors is not made of selfish pig, you can obtain the first best by letting people vote, okay? This is, to me, is a very powerful result. And I ask people in public finance because, to me, is also a justification for democracy or a justification for example, a jury system in the United States. Why? Because if you have nothing at stake and you are not completely a selfish pig, you're going to vote the right thing. That's the beauty of a jury system. That's the beauty of a democratic system, a truly democratic representative system. Now, all this is beautiful, you say, but little problem. Almost half of the US population does not even vote for presidential election. How can we get them to actually vote every year for hundreds of stocks? Because if you're well diversified, and Petra has taught you that you have to be well diversified, and so if you're well diversified, you have at least 500 stocks in your portfolio because you have an index 500. So voting 500 issues every year, forget it. This is not doable. So how can we fix it? And we need to think about an alternative solution, and this is where we had this idea borrowing from a new trend in political science. So let me first tell you about the new trend in political science, and then I'm going to tell you how this applies to our particular case. So this new trend is called citizen assemblies. And, democracy was born in Athens. And in Athens, there were no election. People were randomly drawn. And at the time, they didn't know. Now we know very well that a good randomly drawn selection is very representative. In fact, it's probably more representative of the current democratic system. Because, especially in the United States, where every campaign costs millions and millions of dollars, if you are not rich, you cannot be elected. But if you are randomly drawn and you're paid to participate, it's actually a representative system, okay? And so people have started to create this citizen assembly, and by now there are more than 800 examples. One of the most famous one is the one in Ireland, where they want to come up with something for a proposal of an abortion law. And so they had a citizen assembly craft this proposal, then was validated by a referendum, but was crafted by a citizen assembly. In France, they recently had two citizen assemblies, one on climate, one on end-of-life issue. And the beauty of a citizen assembly is that you have a representative body of people that come together for a little bit of time and is provided with all the information. So it's not a survey, because most of the survey, you are trying, if you ever answer the phone, you're cooking your meal, you're doing something else, and you answer quickly. How thoughtful those answers are, not very much. So you cannot go on a survey base, and most people are not informed. So the beauty of this is that you can be informed, and you compensate them a bit, so they don't become rich, but they compensate so that it's worth their time to come, and they deliberate, and all the evidence suggests that actually they deliberate in pretty thoughtful ways. And so, of course, the idea is, why don't we apply that not to companies, but to mutual funds? And, in the United States, mutual funds are caught between the rock and the hard place. In the same session of Congress, the Republican majority told Larry Fink, number one, you cannot profit out of investing in China, but you cannot do ESG at the cost of profits. And so, wait a second. Either you're profit maximizing or you're not profit maximizing. If you profit maximize all the time, including being in China. Or if you are not profit maximizing, who decides what you do? Because for some people, the Chinese threat is looming large. For others, the destruction of the planet's even larger. And so why don't you let people speak? Now, of course, it's crazy to think that every individual that participates in a Vanguard fund will actually go and vote for 400 companies every year. You must be an academic to have the time to lose, okay? Most human beings don't do that. However, we can actually simply randomly select people, and you have to do stratified selection because you're afraid that some people might not participate. There are a lot of details that I skip here, and we're working on to make it realistic, but there are a lot of details. But once you have that, then you have a bunch of people that will decide how their companies will behave. And honestly, will they behave even more aggressively with China or less aggressively, more aggressively with the planets, not aggressively? Honestly, I don't know. And that's the beauty, that under the ignorance, what I'm telling you is that's the right thing to do, not because I want this particular result, but that because is the logical thing to do. Taking Friedman seriously, that is the only answer. You want to do what your investors want, why don't you ask them? And because it's too costly to ask them, this is the most efficient way to ask them, because by every statistical method, this will reproduce what we will do if we add the time and effort and information to do it. So it's an extremely efficient way because minimize the participation cost, reducing the lobbying advantage, and really overcome the rational ignorance paradigm that plague our democratic system. And to some extent, that's what happens with US juries. Why US juries are not elected? Very simple. Because who is going to participate in that election? Only people with an interest at stake, which are precisely the one you don't want to participate in that election. Okay? And so the beauty of random selection is exactly to avoid that, is to create that ideal system where a small shareholder decide according to his or her preferences. And that's what we're going to... and by the way, Bauer et al. Have applied a similar idea in the Netherlands, and I think there is some hope that this might take over. And Meta has tried something similar, but only with consumers, so which is not a bad idea. I don't trust Meta, even bearing gifts. But I think that the idea is not bad in the sense that once you have all your friends in Facebook or Instagram, you are basically locked in. And that creates a ex post rent that needs to be allocated in some way. You don't want that rent to be allocated to maximize shareholders' value because that's opportunistic. You want to have some saying from the consumers who are the one that are taking advantage. So having a serious discussion with consumers is, with the citizen assembly is an excellent idea. If this is run by Meta, I doubt that that's what they achieve, but I think that shows that there is potential in this idea. Now, do we think that we can change things? And I'm actually running out of time, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I want to, this is not a paper of mine, but a paper by some people at LSE, and they look at the intervention that the New York pension board did on various companies, and they measure actually the actual amount of toxic waste release. These are not ESG ratings that I'm sorry to say are not worth the money you pay for them. This is actually poison put in the environment. And what they show is that the pressure of one relatively small institutional investor can actually make a real difference on the behavior of companies. So imagine if all of us can do it, if all of us can express our beliefs and our desires through some citizen assembly, and that carry the vote of 20, 30%, because those are the numbers of the stock. They can change corporate America, as you know. Now, of course, if you're Steve Kaplan, say, and everybody will go private, so that we'll not have to deal with that. Now, first of all, if you're Microsoft or NVIDIA, good luck, because I don't think you can be taken private easily. And second, we are going to deal with them, and we have some recipe for privately held company too, so we're going to deal with that. But for the first order of business, which is to fix the largest companies today, I think that is not only the right thing, it's also what Milton Friedman was saying, taking seriously, and he continued the conversation with George Stigler, but unfortunately they stopped. So, and I will stop as well. So let me summarize. So corporations have a large impact on society beyond the economic value added they generate. And traditionally, these externalities have been dealt via regulation or taxation. However, regulation works really well with Chuck E. Cheese. If you're not American and you don't have kids, you don't know what Chuck E. Cheese is, but it's a small sort of chain that is not really powerful enough to have even a lobbying system, okay? So if you're Chuck E. Cheese, the idea that you maximize profits given regulation is perfectly fine. If you're Exxon, it's not. And then think about what Western companies do in developing countries. Not only there is not a very advanced regulation, they bribe the local officials not to have regulation. Okay? So it's very easy to say, oh, but these primitive guys don't have regulation. Come on. we are bribing them not to have regulation. Then you blame it for being primitive. I think we should blame ourselves. And the third point is, am I trying to say that this should be a substitute for regulation and taxation? Absolutely not. I'm just saying that without this mobilization, we're not going to have regulation or taxation of all these externalities. Why? Because the only thing we are sure about the US election is that corporation will win. Why? Because they finance both sides. Both sides are equally in the pocket of big business. And so the election is just to decide whether you have abortion right or not abortion right, which is a very important topic, but has nothing to do with the economy, because the economy, nothing will change. Okay? And so I think is only through a combination of government intervention and sort of private intervention that we can fix the problem. And while corporate democracy is an improvement, is not going to solve all the problems. So I'm sorry I only solved one problem, not all the problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I guess we'll segue immediately into the panel. This was very interesting and provocative as always. So let me. So I'm Per Stromberg, and I'm helping Bo and to organize this conference, professor at SSE. We're very happy to have our two prominent panelists here that will hopefully challenge Luigi a bit on some of his proposals, and also hear a bit, because both of you have practical experience also from corporate governance, is here what kind of problems would you see with increasing shareholder democracy. Let me first introduce Petra Hedengran, who is a managing director and general counsel at Investor AB. I guess most people in the room know of Investor AB, but it's traditionally, I guess, the holding company associated with the Wallenberg family, which has been an important player in Swedish business for, I don't know how long, 100 plus years, 150 maybe. And she's also responsible for the corporate governance or issues, as well as being on the board of Electrolux, one of your the companies that you are a big owner in. And then we have Mireia Giné, who is a professor at IESE in Barcelona. And she's a very prominent and famous, I would say, researcher in corporate governance, on particularly when it comes to shareholder influence, shareholder voting, but also you are a board member of a large Spanish bank, Board Sabadell, so you have one foot in each world here. Let me just, before I turn to you, you didn't have time to go through a lot of details on this, the investor, what did you call them, committees?
Investor assemblies.
Investor assemblies. So, and this would be the mutual funds, not the firms would pick. So, would you pick it randomly, or would it depend on how much you own of this mutual fund?
That's a very important point. I think that we're going to pick randomly, but the number of tickets you have in the lottery is a function of how much you own.
Yeah.
However, once you are in the assembly, is one person, one vote.
Yeah.
Okay, so because this is a kind of a compromise, because on the one hand, deliberation, you don't want to have one person that carries 10 votes, because then it's not really a deliberation process.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we do want to maintain the principle of representation based on how much. And so, yes, so we weight basically a probability of being randomly picked by how much you owe.
But once you're in there, it's one vote.
Yeah.
So it's not just that the big owners decide everything.
Yeah.
And then the second thing, more as a clarification, because I think it's useful for the discussion going forward. So what kind of decisions did you envision you would vote for? Because these mutual funds, they may own 100 or some, if you're an index fund, many companies. I guess you're not talking about all the issues in the voting on how are you going to vote on Volvo's General Assembly, or is it going to be like more broad things, or how do you think?
I think that at the moment we envision more guidelines. So we're working on trying to understand, for example, the guidelines of political disclosure and political contribution. And very often the devil is in the detail. Now I don't want to bother the non-US audience, but when people say I disclose my contribution, the important thing is whether you disclose your contribution to the so-called 501c4 organizations that are basically the dark money organization, and the 501c5, which is basically the Chamber of Commerce and the other lobby organization. And most of the time, this is not disclosed. Or when they say we prohibit, they say, we prohibit them to use the money for particular purposes, but money is fungible. So I think that what you want is an investor assembly to have very tight guidelines and say, we want to vote for proposal in this direction. And you have a number of social entrepreneurs that make proposal in various grounds. And so once you have a guideline, you're going to have these guys make proposal according to the guideline, and this will be implemented. So it will be a back and forth that will lead pretty quickly to a dramatic change in my view. Now, of course, you're not going to go to the detail that you have to move. But think about in the case of the environment, one very simple rule is you want to act as if you add a carbon tax of $100 per ton of CO2 emission. That's a very simple proposal to pass. With this guideline, you change the world, right?
Yeah. Great, thank you. So we'll come back to this proposal, I think, later on. But I want to start with Petra. So Investor IB is, I guess, a different type of shareholder. You tend to own your companies. You have relatively large stakes in the companies you own. You tend to be a shareholder for a long time. You tend to be on the board and have quite a lot of influence. So I guess I'm interested in maybe just hearing how you work with issues on the trade-off between profits and other societal values, how you think about that and try to influence the companies you own.
Our business model is to invest and build best-in-class companies and create sustainable value through engaged ownership. That's what we say. And as you said, we buy to build. We don't have an exit horizon. And the value we create for our shareholders is through dividends received and the increase of value in our portfolio companies, so not by exiting. And as an owner, we engage actively with our portfolio companies. We drive value creation plan, focus on future-proofing, maximizing long-term value. We have three strategic priorities to deliver on our ultimate goal, and that is to grow net asset value, pay a steadily rising dividend, and deliver on our ESG targets. So sustainability is one of our strategic priorities, and it's our firm belief that that approach is not in conflict with doing things that are so to say inferior for other shareholders. We actually think it's a sustainable business model is actually a prerequisite to be able to create long-term value. Keeping stakeholders happy is required in order for our companies to be successful in the next 30, 40 years. And I think one thing here that I wanted to discuss, because you talked a lot about maximizing profit, which is, simplified, that is a very sort of short-term thinking, but I think a lot of shareholders and companies are actually working to create long-term shareholder value. That means, yes, maximizing the value, but it's not equal to maximizing profits at the expense of other considerations. And I think that's the time horizon is really, really important here.
I completely agree, and I'm with you. But I think Milton Friedman will not be upset to say I maximize a long-term value. I think that the identification of long-term value with societal value is misleading, and that my favorite example is precisely IBM. IBM suffered no reputational cost for selling a machine to the Nazi, and by the way, I discovered also Ford was selling some stuff to the Nazi. And so that was value maximizing in the long term. And so the question is, are you willing to say no because this is wrong? Or you're saying, the only thing I care is about the reputation. And so if the world at large doesn't know, I can do whatever you want because it doesn't know. So that's the tension. So my question for you is, when you are on the board over there, how do you resolve this tension? I grant you that we should look long term, but imagine I tell you, you can get away with murder. Are you willing to go there because you maximize value or not?
Actually, my personal stance in that is that everything will be revealed one way or the other.
That's a convenient
yeah,
which is false empirically.
It's
convenient and false.
Yeah, but that, you have the reputation to protect, and 40 years from now, they're going to know you sold to the Nazis.
But IBM did not suffer any cost, and there's even ambiguity. They to these days, you go to say, no, we didn't do it. So, and they create another company. So DuPont dumped the PFOA, that is something very toxic, in the Ohio River, knowing that was killing people. They did it. And when they were discovered, they spun off, and now we didn't do it. It was Kenmore that did it. Why? Because they spun off. So you can hide reputation. This story that reputation fixes all the problems is very convenient,
I'm not
but
saying,
false.
I'm not saying it fixed all the problems, and I'm not saying there are examples of very bad things, obviously, that have happened. But I think it's too simplified to talk about maximizing profits and disregarding other considerations. Another thing that I think may be important to say is also that we emphasize a lot of the boards of the companies, and that's crucial to our ownership. As you said, we have our own representatives, but we also put so much effort in finding the right skill and experience. And then we have business teams consisting of our board members and analysts, investment professionals with deep knowledge about the company, industry dynamics and competitive landscape, to identify key strategic value drivers. And sustainability is very much a part of that, because there are risks and opportunities in that. And to be successful and competitive and in good standing in 50 years, you need to take a lot of consideration on that, I think.
Mireia, it'd be interesting to hear
my views
on if you have anything to contribute to the debate, give a punch on to Luigi, maybe.
So Luigi, you've talked about giving power to shareholders and to the common citizen through these voting moments. I would say that there are as well other moments of truth for corporations that voting is essential. And for example, bringing it back to what we are currently living at Sabadell, which is a hostile takeover by BBVA. And I would say, for those of you that are board members, it's really important to know who your shareholders are, because it's going to be different if they are a majority of US funds, or if they are as well shareholders that are clients of yours. So what we know is that, we're going to have a set of shareholders that are going to be maximizing their financial interest. And in fact, 20% of our shareholders have positions in BBVA, and many more have positions in the rest of the banking industry in Spain, which is pretty consolidated. So probably their financial interest will dominate and will vote in order to consolidate further this industry, while we have as well some owners that are banking with Sabadell and banking with BBVA and would be much more interested in having competition, right? So if the regulator does not have something to say, shareholders will call it, and depending on who is your base, you're going to have a more pro-competition versus pro-consolidation outcome. So, I mean, question back to you, do you think that we should bring these situations as well into what you are proposing, more of this assembly approach?
I think
I'm coming back, I was thinking, an analogy to your thing, right? You pick 100 random shareholders. There are like a couple, very few shareholders for whom this is catastrophic or would really hurt. Add all of that stuff up, maybe it's better to listen to those two than the other.
But also, you don't want to prevent things that might benefit society. You're not moving with the principle of not breaking any egg, because otherwise you don't move. So I think that, but Mireia, you're pointing out to probably the most important aspect, because a lot of people have said, in general, why do you let shareholders vote? Because if they're well diversified, they might vote for collusion. Okay, and the answer in general with collusion is to say the beauty of having a vote is that it's public. And so if they vote for collusion, it takes an effort for the antitrust to close their eyes. Now, they've done that before, so it will not be the first line. But with a vote saying, please collude, I think is, so the more you force this choice openly, the more visible it is. Now, the point of the...
I didn't say collusion, I said concentration.
I understand, I'm coming to that. I said, so I'm not too worried about the collusion. Certainly on the concentration issue, they will go along. And that's where I think an antitrust is inevitable. How do you ensure the antitrust is not completely in the hands of the industry? First of all, going back to Stigler, the antitrust is, in principle, the least likely to be completely captured because it's well diversified. The more industry-specific an authority is, the more capture it is, the antitrust. However, I think that I'm the first one to say we need a strong antitrust authority, and we need to make sure that companies, including the companies you're on the board of, don't, in the past, lobby to weaken the antitrust. So I think that if we have general votes ex ante to say, should we lobby in that direction, the investor should say no. Okay, and this is the point. I'm really keen. I'm sorry, but I'm really keen on this difference, because you're absolutely right. We should look at long-term shareholder value. But I had this discussion a few years back with a guy from Ilmes Fund, and I said, look, you are a shareholder of Disney. Probably, I don't know whether investor owns Disney, but last year was a crucial year in Disney because the copyright on the Mickey Mouse was about to expire. Okay, and so are you willing, as an investor, to tell Disney to lobby, use every tool available, legal tool available, which in the United States there are many, to basically capture the legislator to pass an extension of the Copyright Act of 1998 that was well known as the Mickey Mouse Copyright Act, because Disney started to produce it. So if you are looking at the long-term value, you should say absolutely, right? If you look at, is this the right thing to do? You're basically taking money away the little kids who want to have and giving it to the shareholder. This is like really Robin Hood on reverse, okay? So my question is, you are an investor, and I don't know whether you own Disney, but imagine you own Disney. What are you telling Disney? Lobby or not lobby?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you're really being put on the spot.
But I think we're really coming down to the issue of, what is the purpose of the cooperation and who is it for? And to some extent, I mean, you have to attract risk capital and investors. So I think it's a tricky question also to say, no, we're not going to lobby on this because, that would be detrimental to a number of children, that can't see Mickey Mouse because it's too expensive or so forth. And the question is, what are you doing with the shareholders' money and the investments, and how do you keep attracting risk capital for projects?
Yeah, but
I'm not saying this is exactly where you should lobby, but you could think about pharmaceutical company who puts extensive amounts of money into R&D, should they not be allowed to, have a view on that the patents perhaps needs to be longer because otherwise it's not worthwhile to do, to research on new medicine and so forth. So you can switch that around also in a way that, it's good for society.
Actually, pharmaceutical companies spend more money in marketing than in R&D, and their lobbying is mostly to allow Me Too patent to be created that have zero value for society but enormous value for companies. So I'm not saying we should not have patent, but I'm saying that it's not a very good example. I would like to be on the other side. But at some point, we should have a limit, because if you're saying that to attract risk capital, we also want to have zero tax on corporation, right? This will attract more capital. And we probably want a dictatorship government. In a sense, Pinochet was really good for capital and attracted a lot of capital. So where do we put a limit?
I think you're driving it a bit.
I understand. I understand. But between zero and that, we need to draw a line. Who draws a line and where?
Yeah, exactly.
I'd
And
like
then
to-
you have to go back to the purpose of the company, actually, I think.
No, but the purpose is the purpose of why I invest my money in a company, okay?
Yeah.
And I want to have a return, but I also want to live in a free society, and I don't want to kill babies. So I think that saying that the purpose of the company is only to make money, I think is ignoring the other side.
Can we talk about accountability of boards?
Uh-huh.
Because, okay, because you give this example in your paper that DuPont, the shareholders made this proposal to force DuPont to disclose pollution policies, the effectiveness of their pollution policies, and what they were doing in terms of putting all these pellets into the environment. And the proposal in 2020 passed only by 20%. In 2021, which is the example that you give, passed by 82%, and the response of DuPont was very, very mild. And they said, okay, here's our policies, and that's it, right? So they haven't disclosed the details on the pellets, they haven't disclosed anything about the efficiency. Is that okay for the board, right?
No,
So you're going to improve the voting outcomes. You're going to have all these proposals, or these social environmental proposals, move from 20, let's say, to the 80 or to the 90s. Are the boards going to respond? Do we have a legal environment to force boards to really be accountable to their shareholders? That is
Absolutely. With the investor assembly, we say, if you don't implement what we ask, we don't vote for you anymore. We are fired. So there is nothing like the threat of being fired that changed the mind of people. And I think that is very simple. The reality is that the institutional investors that are now managing this, starting with BlackRock, is more posture than reality. Okay? And so they don't want to use the tool they have. If you empower the people with investor assembly, they will say, you don't follow the rules, out.
So empowering means that second part. So
the second part, absolutely, but they have the power to vote. Believe it or not, you can vote against, because one of my favorite lines that doesn't make me very popular, but I say the closest thing to Soviet elections are board elections in the United States. Why? Because you have the incumbent choosing the list. You have as many candidates as places. And people can vote yes or abstain. If you abstain or don't vote, you might be punished or retaliated. And now, in some cases, even if you don't get elected, you're co-opted on the board anyway. Okay? So there is zero accountability. I'm 100% with you. There is zero accountability.
Exactly.
But the responsibility is completely in the hands of Larry Fink, Vanguard, and company that don't want that accountability. Why? Because they have too much power. Because the moment they use that accountability themselves, they become the new central planner of the Soviet Union. Because let's face it, in a sense, there are three people that control corporate America. And Larry Fink and the owner of the owner, it's not the owner because it's a mutual, but the CEO of Vanguard and the CEO of State Street.
Not yet in Sweden, though.
Not yet in Sweden.
Not yet in Sweden.
No,
Who
but
control Sweden are the families. So back to another point.
Yeah, and I think maybe that also speaks for an not best governance system in the US when it comes to selecting
completely
board
agree.
members.
I completely agree. In
And
Sweden,
it's
it's
quite
much
different,
better.
different here.
Yeah, and we're going to have a panel later on about boards and board election. We can come back to that. But I think you also raised something interesting, which is one of the biggest, most important trends in corporate governance is the rise of these huge institutions, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets, and so forth. And I guess it'd be interesting to hear how you feel this has changed corporate governance in the companies here in Europe that you know, because all of a sudden, I guess, these are important players also in Swedish companies.
Yeah, I think it has changed to a certain extent. On the other hand, Sweden, where I'm active, we have a system with a lot of controlling shareholders or large influential shareholders. So it hasn't affected as much as I'm sure it has in a more scattered system with many shareholders. And I think it also goes back to the question of proxy advisors.
Yeah.
It's sort of in the same category. And I think one of the things that we have, because we have so strong shareholder rights, we actually have, I think we are, proportionally very high on AGM rights and shareholder impact. And because of that, we also have very strong minority protection. I mean, extremely strong. And having companies or investors, large institutions, and proxy advisors who don't really know the system or vote more according to their policy can be quite value destructive because they can, by 10% of the votes, stop something. And that has become evident, and that we have a very vulnerable system because of our very developed shareholder rights that we really think are important.
I mean, I think that that's sort of one of the, relates to, I guess, your proposals about giving, increasing shareholder democracy. What if shareholders have no idea, right? What if BlackRock doesn't even know what this board nomination committee is, or just always votes no because, you don't have independent board members, while the word independent in Swedish corporate governance means something completely different than in the US and so forth, right? How do you kind of make, is democracy, are people always making good decisions? Should everyone be allowed to vote?
I think you're going down a very dangerous path.
We need a strong man.
Yeah, exactly.
I do add an angle to that, if I may.
Yeah.
And that is that since we have the system with the largest shareholders being on the nomination committee, of course we frequently have large US, Canadian institutions and so forth. So we always ask them, and they are basically never interested in participating because they don't want to commit to be as long-term as it means, because then you need to be able to know some about the strategy, you need to be able to inform if the chairman is leaving in 6 months, blah, blah, blah. And they just say, please don't give me any sensitive information, and no, we're going to refrain from that. So that's just,
I think that Sweden has a better governance system, particularly on the appointment of board members, where you listen to the institutional investors. And there is an advantage in the commitment for the long term because it's easier to sort of incorporate, as you said, all the things in the long term. So I'm not denying that. But I think that part of the problem with the American institutional investors, one is the short-termist, but the other one is that they really don't want to exercise that power. At some point, I was in a committee and I was trying to push for Vanguard and company to be more actively involved. And it costs money. And they are competing on how cheap what they're doing is. And as a result, they go to the minimum common denominator, which is to do nothing. However, I think that this is where I think that maybe there is some product differentiation. The moment you sell a S&P 500 index with a voice, where you do the same replication and you pay a few basis points more to actually have a voice, I expect people to buy it.
Yeah.
Maybe people will not, but
Yeah.
I think that will be the proof is in the pudding.
Just to add
Yes.
on something about the voting by these passive funds. So BlackRock and Vanguard, they are exploring with new ways of delegating their votes. And if you stay tomorrow, Laura Stark will present research on, what do we learn when the fund managers get to vote and they don't have to follow the centralized stewardship advice. And what we observe is that what Laura Starks and co-authors observe is that they vote more in favor of environmental proposals, more on social proposals, and improvements of governance. Now, the question is why, right? Why is it the case that you're going to have this difference between what the stewardship team and versus the managers? And are these managers voting for the greater good, or are they voting to keep their reputation, social reputation? These votes are public. So, I mean, these delegated forms are interesting.
But this is the beauty, in my view, of investor assembly. You let the people decide, and there is no reputation because you don't know who they are.
Yeah.
And so they vote their conscience. They vote what they like. And I think today, precisely because votes are public, is a bit like in the Soviet Union, there is retaliation. And so everybody was voting for Stalin, because if you didn't vote for Stalin, you end up in a concentration camp. Now, it's not a concentration camp. The concentration camp is you don't eat tomorrow because your source of a livelihood is cut from you. But it's a similar form of punishment. So surprise, surprise, people are very compliant because they don't want to intimidate powerful people.
Yeah.
I should take the opportunity maybe to open up if anyone has any questions.
My personal experience, I was the first lady in the board, and now we are 5 and we are 50%. And it has changed the dynamics of board meetings. It has changed the topics. In particular, we've done an analysis, a detailed analysis on gender differences, compensation, going up the ladder, and so forth. Environmental issues are much more prominent as we have more diversity. So that has been my personal experience.
Is that your...
No, I can say that because I'm the chairman of the nomination committees where we are the chair. And when we look for new competence, and I think for future-proofing our companies, so, it's digital and it's sustainability, we tend to look for younger people. Because that's where it's easier to find the talent. So to that extent, it is shifting a bit slowly.
And do you notice sometimes in boards that the sort of old farts in the board who like to go hunting and stuff, that they think much less, put less weight on certain issues compared to the young?
I couldn't say that, but the more sort of technical knowledge and staying ahead with what's happening. We need the younger generation. But I think as having it as a priority and being very dedicated, I don't think there is a difference.
I mean, to have a challenge culture at the board, it really depends on who's your chairman. So,
absolutely.
If you don't have a chairman that is going to embrace that and allow for that, then you can have a lot of diversity on paper, but very little on action.
I think if we broaden this, though, it's not just about boards, right? There's more and more research out that attracting the right employees is actually sort of a governance mechanism, right? If people don't want to work for unethical, bad companies, especially maybe younger generation. And there's some former colleagues of mine that have paper shows that you can, clean or high ESG profile companies can actually pay people less because they get private benefits from working. Is that sort of an important?
Absolutely, and I think that's where we're back to, the company creating long-term value and caring about their brand, because the brand is key. And you have younger and younger customers, and you have employees that you need to attract, and whatever is important for them is important for your brand. So, definitely.
But I think I agree with you, Per, but I think it's important to stress that this comes at a cost. And so in that paper, they show that people are paid less. And I had a friend of mine said, oh, this is at the expense of workers.
Yeah.
And no, I think that in all our research with Oliver is about there is a trade-off and shareholders pay a cost.
Yeah.
So this stuff doesn't come for free, but you are willing to trade off certain money for values. And I think you should do it as a shareholder, you should do, of course, as an employee, and also as a customer.
So this is a way of introducing that more explicitly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying any form or shape that private provision of public good by corporation is perfect. What I say is should not be prohibited, and under the current system is kind of prohibited because you have to have a narrow, and we should encourage, particularly we should encourage the non-provision of public bad, which is the implicit or explicit corruption of the governance system. But is that in any way perfect? No. But in the same way in which I think that private donations are a good complement, and here we benefit from some benefactors, right? And we don't object to that, but that's not a substitute. The Swedish government gave a lot of money to other initiatives to fix the distributional aspect. I think that in no way I'm saying that's the only thing that should take place. Absolutely not. I don't want to be misinterpreted in that way.
I mean, I think there's one thing we haven't touched on here, which is part of, there's a third person, I guess you could have added to the historical figures here, which is Michael Jensen, right? Who was very skeptical about ESG and having other, I mean, at least in his, before he went into this cult, and then he changed his mind.
Michael just changed over his life.
Yeah, but one of the points he made was that shareholder value is very easy to measure, while, and you mentioned yourself, these ESG measures, are not worth paper they're written on, or whatever the quote was, right? I mean, it's just very hard to measure these things and decide what's the right thing to do. I mean, maybe if we have emissions of toxic waste in the river, that's one thing, but there are other cases where it's not as clear, or the trade-offs may not be as
absolutely. Is the world simpler if you just maximize value? Absolutely. Is it the right world? No. Can we move a little bit in that direction? Now, there is maybe too much of a good thing if you overshoot in that direction. But we're so, especially in the United States, so far from that point that I think that...
So I guess the Jensen critique, at least the old Jensen, was that, okay, sure, but these things are so hard to measure and so subjective that you basically leave managers to do whatever they like because they can excuse any type of action with some ESG goal
but that's exactly where our model prevents that. Our model is saying we are making trade-offs, but we're making trade-offs with the permission of our shareholders. After all, if you are the only owner, you don't maximize profits, you maximize your utility. And Oliver doesn't like me to cite this, but I find it fascinating that of all people, one of the person who is most in favor of this approach is Justice Alito in the Supreme Court. Of course, for completely opposite reasons, but he says very clearly that if you are a corporation and you want to close on Sunday because your shareholders think that it's more important to honor the Lord than to make profits on Sunday, you should have the right to do so. I don't think that this is so revolutionary, but in today's America, it is revolutionary.
So the question is, I guess, are the shareholders informed enough to do that trade-off? Because that can be a very, very complex decision. And
citizen assemblies or investor assemblies are exactly for that. Now, you might not trust it, but in the United States, we trust people to decide whether somebody goes to jail or not, which is even a more important decision. So why we don't let the judge decide that in the United States? Because we trust the people. I understand that in Europe, there's a different tradition, a bit less democratic.
I think
say that you should let the people with expertise operate.
One of the reasons everyone tries to get out of jury duty is it takes so freaking long to these, right?
But
I
that,
to
think
get
there is a
informed enough.
reason why shareholders choose, the board to manage the company, because they choose the expert to do that. And I think that,
absolutely. And I will never want to override an expert on a business decision. But what I am saying here are value decisions. So it's not a decision of how to operate. I let a surgeon decide how to operate. I let the board decide how to operate. But whether at some point I want to take out the life support, that's a value decision. I don't want to have the doctor make that decision. I want to have the people involved make that decision. That's exactly the distinction why business decision belongs to the board, value decision belongs to the shareholders.
And who decides what is what? Because that can be a very, very tricky thing.
First of all, there are some value decisions that are obviously value decisions. So, for example, when we say we don't want to send money to Russia, want to divest from Russia because of what Russia did, that's a value decision. Let's recognize that this is not maximizing the value in the long term, blah, 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 blah. It's not, okay? It's losing money, but we do it because it's the right thing to do. The managers should be clear about this and should ask the shareholders, do you want to do it or not? As simple as that.
And I think the typical manager will decide to exit Russia because it will not be value creative in the long term. It will destroy the brand, etc.
Actually, I'm not so sure that's the case. And so McDonald's left on the table $1.4 billion. Okay? Now, was it good for the effort of the war? My claim is actually they should keep selling McDonald's to Russia so they die. Okay? So it's not even obvious that divesting was helping the war effort. So I don't know why they left. And I asked a board member, and the board member said, because the CEO told that the employees wanted to go out. And I said, most employees of McDonald's don't know where Russia is on the map. So how can you really say that with a straight face?
And also, I've been involved in many of these, discussions. And exiting Russia, everybody wanted to do that, but how you do it and in which time frame and which risks you take with the people locally there is a very, very tricky decision. And it's not as simple as, exit Russia.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not a true value decision where you don't need to take a lot of consideration.
No, of course, there are implementation, but it's like saying, politics decision, international politics decisions are very complex. Okay? And so we should let the expert do it. And voters should have no say.
Let me
at the end of the day, how to get out of Afghanistan is a technical decision, but whether we want to keep fighting Afghanistan or not is a value decision but voters should do, not decide by the Pentagon.
I think I don't quite buy that argument because it's a bit of a difference between representative democracy or having referendums on everything, right? So if you have shareholders, then they have power to elect the board, and maybe they should elect. Maybe we should have more board members also selling their values to shareholders when you vote for it.
That's a very important. We could go in that direction, and investor assembly might decide that this might be the right thing to do. However, do you really want to say, you are Steve Kaplan, you are a fantastic manager, but I don't recognize your values. So I will not appoint you as a manager. I want to appoint somebody else who's a terrible manager, but has my value. No, you want to keep the two things separate. One thing Italy did right, they did everything wrong. But one thing they did right is on the abortion, we had a referendum. The referendum 45 years ago, nobody has ever talked about this ever since. In the United States, they try to do with expertise. They're still fighting a battle that is like, give power to the people.
I want to let Mireia in because you're wanting to say something for a long time.
I think that we should go back as well to this accountability of boards. And if this assembly proposal is too hard to move forward, I think that the pushing for more accountability of boards and for responding to what shareholders want, there should be a way of improving that. Not necessarily just talking about diversity or diversity of gender and race and abilities, but real accountability. That might be a simpler battle.
I think this is a perfect segue into the next session, which will start after the break in
There's a question.
30.
Very uncomfortable comment. When you draw 145 million people in Russia, that you want to have the McDonald's so they can die. I think that's because not all Russians are recruited.
You're absolutely right. I apologize. I apologize. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I apologize. And actually, to be honest, I always thought that the reaction in the West was too harsh because it's not justified, not every Russian. But a lot of people, to be honest, starting with Jeffrey Sonnenfeld at Yale, had this view that we should do the worst for Russia so that they will revolt. I don't subscribe to that, but I apologize. I was sort of funny in that way.
Thanks. Thanks for that, pointing that important thing out. Okay, let's take a break, and then we'll reconvene in 30 minutes.